All right. Uh, so welcome. My name is Igor Polatai. The date is January 3rd, 2025, 1:09 p.m. EST. And today I am interviewing Fred Smith about the RIT Student Court. Uh, Very pleased to have you here.
Thank you. Pleased to be here.
All right. So I wanted to start by asking you to give a quick overview about the student court to anyone who might be listening in the future that doesn't know anything about what the RIT student court used to be.
I think I should start by saying that when I arrived here as the 1971 as the Vice President for Student Affairs, one of the first things I was interested in is what role the students were playing in various leadership ways to have an impact and make a contribution to the university. And one of the things I was very impressed with is the already fairly mature existence of what they called a free university, which students develop courses and programs. And one of the main things, types of courses that were offered were teaching sign language to students so that could enhance the interaction between deaf and hearing students. So I was interested in student government, see what role they were playing, how effective it was. Interested in student activities, what students were doing to try to create school spirit. And of course, then importantly, the role that students were playing in dealing with, I guess you would call misconduct matters. And felt, of course, that I felt, and students certainly were interested in feeling that they had a role in pursuing proper procedures and fairness in dealing with various fractions, non-academic infractions. They were focusing on student life infractions, which had to do with minor things all the way to very serious infractions that got into the category of potential dismissal. So there was. I'm a little fuzzy on what the structure was at the time I arrived, but what eventually evolved was a student court, student hearing board that handled matters of misconduct that were less than sort of the in the category of suspension or dismissal from the school. Students were appointed to the board in a way that I don't remember specifically, but I'm sure that students and student government had a very important role in selecting the students who would serve on this board. They obviously had to be students who enjoyed a high level of respect and admiration. They had to be ideal citizens in their own right to be received by students who appeared before them. There were procedures that had been developed and continually refined them. I remember that when I arrived here, there was some feeling, and I don't know exactly why or who expressed it, but there was some feeling that some special attention needed to be given to the student conduct and student adjudication process. So I took a look at that early on. I appointed a staff member who was responsible for receiving complaints, and then working with students and the other staff in determining what the next step would be. Would they be taken to the student hearing board, or then I don't know if we had at that time or not, but we soon had not only a student court, but we had what we called an institute hearing board, which was made up of faculty, staff, and students. And that board served as a hearing board that heard appeals from students who had had a decision made in their case, but felt it was not satisfactory to them, and they wanted to appeal it to a higher authority. So it was the Institute Hearing Board that entertained appeals. As I recall, on some matters that were very serious that might result in the possibility of suspension or even dismissal from the school, some of those I believe went directly to the Institute Hearing Board because they were dealing with more serious matters. Before long, a faculty member, Dr. Stan McKenzie, who was a professor in a College of Liberal Arts, he was a Shakespeare professor, highly respected by faculty and students alike, volunteered to, if he could be released part-time from his teaching responsibilities, volunteered to become the staff member on my staff who would be responsible for handling judicial matters. So when a student created an infraction, they would likely meet with him first, and he would make some judgment as to whether these matters should go to the Student Hearing Board or require going directly to the Institute Hearing Board. And he could offer the student the option of having a decision made by him alone. Some students didn't want to appear before their peers or to another body. They would rather have it handled by an individual. So in some cases, then he would make the decision, but they still would have the prerogative, if they decided eventually that they did not like his decision, still had the opportunity to go to the Institute Hearing Board. So I felt that because of Dr. McKenzie's rapport with students and his high level of expertise, and he was a very dedicated person, not only in his teaching but also for students. And on many occasions, when a student would appear before him, and it appeared to me that that student deserved to be dismissed from the school, he would come to me and say, "Let's not dismiss him. Let me see if I can be helpful to this student." So he was truly dedicated and very effective and highly regarded. So I felt we had a staff person in that position that was not vulnerable to criticism by faculty or students as being an unfair person. He was considered to be a fair person to handle these matters. So having a staff person in that kind of position, that kind of reputation, was very important. Also, the Institute Hearing Board, as I said, involved faculty, staff, and students. Again, I don't recall exactly how we appointed those people. They weren't elected by any kind of student vote. They were appointed by some kind of a due process decision. Those members had to have the same kind of, had to have reputations and be held in high regard by everyone, for otherwise obviously they wouldn't have credibility. So I thought eventually we had a system in place that I, as the Chief Student Affairs Administrator, felt comfortable that students, that we had a system that would treat students effectively and fairly, and would be perceived as a very competent and fair process for dealing with matters of student conduct. So we, for then many years, due to, again, to Dr. McKenzie's commitment, and I think we had a pretty refined procedure that the student court, or the adjudication of student misconduct, I think, was not an object of criticism by the student body, that it was not fair. So I think we arrived at that point, but it did evolve to some extent over time. But I think it's a very good example of how students can play a very important role in the quality of student life at RIT. Students should think of themselves as coming to get something out of their experience here, but hopefully most students would feel that they have an opportunity as a result of being here and being involved to make a contribution to making RIT a better place, and that they would leave here as having some small or maybe large impact in making this a better university. I think we've seen that in a number of ways that we could point out where how important student life has been. And when I was hired here, the president, Dr. Miller, told me that my responsibility, one of my responsibilities, was to see that student life and the educational experience that students got as a result of their being here, the educational experience outside the classroom, that would become an important dimension of their total education here, that they would feel when they leave here that they not only got something out of the classroom, but they got something out of their experience in student life. And of course that depended on students being willing to put some effort into it. And that, so my job was to encourage and recognize and support students and feeling that they had a role in making it a better place, and obviously how students were treated that sort of got out of step was a very important part of that. So that's the overall context of which the student court system functions. I don't require a lot of the details of how things operated, but and things ranged all the way from students getting on placed on just a warning. Well, there was a written ladder of levels of decision that could be made, and these were made known to students in writing in various publications and in other ways also. So students, as a student, you knew if you got in trouble what the potential outcomes of that might be. So I didn't go into it blindly, not having any idea what might happen to you. So as I say, I think this resulted over time, and I assume it continues today, to be obviously a pretty important dimension of student life. If students are bummed out about how they're treated, I mean, student life is a time when you experiment. You can make some mistakes in the way you behave and what you do and what you don't do. So it's a time where you have the opportunity to learn by experience. So the university ought to be structured to take that into consideration, not let you get away with something you shouldn't get away with, but at the same time, we have to let failure be our friend and learn from our mistakes. And that was I think that was the philosophy and the approach that we took in handling matters of student conduct. And I can think of a number of occasions which students who, whether it was an alcohol infraction or any kind of misconduct, they learned from that, and they made the mistake once and not again. There were sadly some occasions in which students didn't seem to learn after several chances to get straight, and they had to leave. And some infractions were serious enough that we usually started out assuming that students would be suspended from the school, but they weren't automatically suspended. A good example was when we had a pretty serious problem with students setting off fire alarms in the residence hall. Pretty serious matter, because when you set off a firearm, the fire department is obligated to arrive, and it has a potential of having a serious, not just a funny thing for some students, but serious consequences for students. So we had to treat that very seriously, and we made it known that if you set off a fire alarm you were probably a candidate for being suspended from school. So that's just an example. So that's kind of an overview of, without remembering the details of how we did things, and I think that was the philosophy and the goals and objectives as to what role we wanted student conduct to play in the quality of student life overall here.
Alright. So what exactly was the structure of the student court system? Because from my understanding, there was various small courts, like a fraternity court and a residential court, that then were appealed to the student court, and then those decisions, if needed, would be appealed to the institute's president. So are you saying that there was a step in between president and student court, and that's where you and your office came in?
Oh yes, now that you mention it, I think it's the residence halls. I don't remember about the Greek organizations, but the residence halls may have had a sort of a beginning, initial level of review of student conduct, where they would handle things that pertain strictly to residence life and could handle that, but they would be pretty minor areas that didn't need to go to the student court. When matters came to the student court, it took some time and effort in the process to making sure things were done right, that students knew what they were getting into, and understanding the process. The president of the university almost never got involved in a student conduct situation. I can't remember. It may have happened, but I don't recall ever that the president got involved. There were times when I don't remember specific instances, but I may have something that had maybe a high profile level of seriousness, that I would let the president know that this is what we were going to do, and the president had the right to ask some questions and even override it, but I don't require the president, which means that the president had to have a high level of confidence in the institute hearing board that involved faculty, staff, and students. It had to have a high level of confidence that they were going to make the right decisions before a president would get involved. So yeah, there were a number of the stepping stones related to the nature of the infraction, and it also related to the process of fairness to make sure that people got that cases got reviewed at the level that they should be reviewed, and students had an opportunity to feel that it had been fair, whether they liked the outcome or not.
All right. So of the few case files that have survived in the archives, we know that the student court undertook stuff like furniture stealing and people kicking holes in walls, too much alcohol, theft. Can you give some examples of some cases that the student court undertook?
Well, those would be good examples, the ones you mentioned, depending on how serious the damage was and it's all on the level, how serious the result was from it. But that sounded like something, the examples you gave, it probably would start with if it were in the residence hall, may have been resolved between the director of residence life and a student court within the residence halls, but something like that would probably begin with a student, the student hearing board of the student court.
Okay, so Dane Gordon, author of the book, The History of RIT, was the first faculty judge in the 1965, which was the first version of the court, which had 7 judges, one of which was appointed by Vice President of Student Personal Services, 4 by President of the Student Association with ratification by the Student Senate, and then 1 faculty from the Faculty Council. Then in 1972, that increased to 9 judges with 3 appointed by the Vice President of Student Affairs. So were there any other constitutional changes other than 1965 and 1972?
Probably not very many after 72. I arrived in 71. I don't, I don't remember that I must have known what the system, well, I knew what the system was when I got here, which would have been 65, but that was 6 years before I got here. And I don't recall feeling that it was in shambles and I needed to go in and read. I think I felt it needed some fine tuning and not total revamping. I do recall that, and I can't, that there was some feeling expressed that not some. This was the end of the decade of the '60s, in which students were, very active, very suspicious about anybody in authority, and that carried over into the '70s to some extent. I didn't find a lot of it at RIT, but when I did arrive, I was aware of the fact that students wanted to check me out to see whether I was going to be a fair person, and that was made known to me. Not that there was a serious students, as you may have read in that, the students were very upset with a lot of problems that existed here. I don't know that they were so much with the judicial system as they were with other things, that facilities that weren't working correctly. It was a pretty serious matter, and the president pointed that out to me, wanted me to know that before I came. But I don't remember hearing complaints that the judicial system was not working well. It was more sort of small but significant uncertainty as to whether the university was or would continue to be student-oriented, student-focused, and that students would get a fair hearing. When I was interviewed here, I was interviewed by one of the members of the Board of Trustees, who was, the board had different committees, and one of the committees was the Student Life Committee. It was composed of trustees and students, and they met once a month and discussed student life matters. Well, the chairman of that committee, a trustee, interviewed me in the president's office, and after he talked with me, he said, "I have a final question. If there was a matter in which students wanted to do something that the trustees didn't agree with, and you could go either way, who were you going to go with?" And I didn't know what answer he was looking for, but I said, "I'm going to go with the students." So he smiled and he said, that's the answer I wanted to hear you give. So I let the trustees know up front that while students were going to be expected to be good citizens here, I was not going to be ruling with a hand-fist kind of administrator. In fact, if you read the Reporter, the first Reporter magazine that came out in the fall, it was the orientation issue. The editor was Greg somebody, and I've forgotten his last name. He was on the search committee. He interviewed me, and this initial, it was the orientation issue. He, to some extent, he was a member of the search committee. To some extent, he was inappropriate in saying that what some of the members of the search committee thought of me, both positive and negative. He frankly violated a confidentiality. But he ended up saying, basically, he thought I was a good guy and I was going to be a good vice president. So, and then Dr. McKenzie, who was, he was very highly regarded by students. He'd been voted as the young, outstanding teacher. He, as soon as I got on campus, he came to visit with me, and he admitted he wanted to check me out to see if I was going to be if I was going to be a student-oriented vice president. So it wasn't anything that wasn't a big suspicion, but obviously a new person, you want to check him out to see how well he's going to wear with students, where the students are going to feel good about the administration or not. Because if you get on the wrong side of students, then that negatively influences everything else the administration tries to do. So every president needs to learn that, and I think President Munson, for example, he's done a good job to show, at least my impression from the outside, he's done a good job of letting students know he's a human being who likes students, he can have fun with students, and let students make fun of him. I used to go out and let students put me through the dunking booth and that kind of thing. You gotta let students know that you're a human being. I'm getting a little off track, but it's all part of the context in which students feel that there's an atmosphere of fairness.
Yeah, so you would generally say that student opinions of specifically the student court and being able to be judged by a panel of students was well received?
I think it was. Yeah, I don't recall the court, the different levels of the court, being openly criticized by students, because it really, I think we were very meticulous by involving not only students but faculty and staff too, and in making sure that that we not only were fair but were perceived as being fair. Now we had a couple incidents in which I came in direct conflict with what students want to do. I don't know if you've seen in any of the archives that the Student Activities Board, who was responsible for showing movies in the Angle Auditorium, one year wanted to show an X-rated movie. And I was contacted by a local politician who had been successful in closing down an X-rated theater in Rochester. He called me and said, if you show that movie, want you to know I'm going to sue you. And so we had our own attorney, and they also called in the attorney from the Civil Liberties Union, which always take the side of the offended. And both of our attorneys agreed that there's no way that we can responsibly say we're going to ignore this threat and show the movie anyway. It would be not in the best interest of the students. So I agreed to have a meeting with the student leaders and call both of these attorneys in, and I had both of them tell the student leaders not what I wanted to do, but what they, as an outside attorney and the institute attorney, felt was in the best interest in the institution. So we compromised on that. We then had some of the faculty said, well, X-rated movies have their artistic aspect also, not just content. So we agreed to have another movie, X-rated movie shown, but shown in a limited audience where faculty would be there, watch the movie with students, and would critique it as a work of art. And so we were willing to compromise. But anyway, I think that didn't go through the court system, but it was a matter of student conduct adjudication.
Okay. Um, so when did you leave your role as vice president?
I'd have to check the records when it was in the 80s. It was when, soon after President Simone arrived, he decided he wanted to do some reorganization and wanted to align some offices that did not report directly to him. He wanted them to report directly to him. The primary one was that did report to him, but through a different administrator who had moved on to something else, was the role of the Institute, the secretary of the Institute. That's the title of the administrator that works with, supports the board of trustees, and RIT is a large board. So I assumed that responsibility, and also responsibility for some organizations that had a important connection to the president's office. One was Nathaniel Rochester Society, which was an organization of our major donors. He wanted that attached directly to his office. Another was alumni relations. There was a lot of dissatisfaction with how the alumni relations was not as good as it should be, so that was included. So there was another group called the Institute of Fellows, which was an organization of community people that of retirees, important people in the community that the president wanted to relate to the university, and President Miller, set up this organization called the Institute of Fellows. So I had that cluster of organizations, or departments, I should say, that became a new position that then was secretary of the Institute and assistant to the president. And I've forgotten exactly which year it was, but that's in the records. But it was under President Simone, soon after President Simone arrived.
So by the time you left your position, was the student court still intact, or was it abolished? Because nowadays the student court does not exist. It has been replaced by a student conduct system with a new student conduct office.
Oh, I really don't know what happened after I left. I've stayed interested in what happened in student affairs, but I have not kept directly involved in, or even with regard to the administrative parts of student affairs. The only thing that I have been continually interested in watching is the development of school spirit here. That's because when I came here, school spirit was not an attractive feature for potential students. It got bad grades. Students said things like, it's a great place to go to class, but a lousy place to live. That's the way they were talking. So one of my charges from the president was to develop school spirit. And, as I said, school spirit doesn't happen. Administration doesn't say, well, we're going to go out and have school spirit. You do things that support it. Like along the way, we decided to put athletic emphasis on hockey because we thought that had the best chance of all athletic teams to get school spirit. Obviously, that's paid off. We decided to put more emphasis on having a homecoming that pulled everybody in, and that has worked well. The athletics program overall has, of course, added a lot to school spirit. We decided along the way that we needed better student-focused facilities, especially in the recreation area. So we built the Student Life Center. It was about an $11 million project, and it was the concept. It was a health and wellness and recreation combined facility that contained a health service, the counseling center, and a recreation center. So the establishment of the Student Life Center was another thing that the administration could do and did do to enhance school spirit. But students themselves, I think, have come up with some, very creative things that have, I think now, both the combination of programs and facilities and student orientation was a real positive when I arrived here. The new student orientation was already a very active group, and students wanted to become part of it. So now I think my impression from the outside is that when you visit campus and see what's going on here, now student life is a bonus, is a beneficial in attracting students to want to come here, along with a lot of other things. So that's the thing I've been mainly interested in, and why I've been so interested in seeing the tiger statue and the whole tiger story get due recognition, is because it stands out, I think, among one of the stories of look at what students can do. So I think I think RIT has come a long, long way since I first came here. Part of it I hope that I contributed to, but a lot of it has happened since I moved out of the student affairs position.
So, do you recall if the student court was still active when you left the vice president role?
Oh yeah, it was still active when I left that position. I just don't know what the vice president that followed me did some major organization, renamed some of the departments, organized it, and I really didn't. I had plenty to think about in my new job. I didn't really. I was interested in and supported her, but I really didn't try to critique or even try to keep my nose involved in what was going on. And she did a good job. She was followed by another very competent vice president, Mary Beth Cooper, who I thought did a fabulous job and was very student oriented and highly regarded by students. So my impression is that things have continued to be fine-tuned more and gotten better since I left that position.
Who was the vice president who succeeded you? Do you remember that?
Yeah, Linda Cook, K-U-K. She came and lasted about 5 years, I think, and then left and took a job at Colorado State University out in Colorado, and Mary Beth followed her. And then, of course, Sandra Johnson is the current vice president, and I've gotten to know her, and I think highly of her also.
All right. So I guess the central question from all of this is, with the student court having powers to suspend or expel students, and that's something that Dane mentioned in his book is something unusual, but that they wanted to trust students with this power. The overall goal, what was the overall goal for giving students such great powers over other students and allowing students to potentially expel their own peers?
Well, they didn't, the student court didn't really have the ultimate power to suspend anybody. And I don't recall the student court might have made a decision that suspension was warranted, but as I said, the student had and in some cases the student court might say, we don't think we can make a decision on this, and might refer it on to the higher court. But they didn't have, the student court didn't have, they had a lot of responsibility, and of course power and responsibility go together, but I didn't think that students ever felt that the student court had a lot of power, so to speak, but but were positioned to make fair judgment and recommend what they thought was a correct decision. But we didn't. The administration couldn't let somebody be suspended solely on the decision of a student court.
From past case records, other punishments inflicted by the student courts have been finding students and also sentencing them to work hours with what was then called protective services, now is public safety. Were those things that the student court were able to just adjudicate, or would those also have to be also confirmed by someone administration?
Something like work hours, which were intended to be an educational experience for the students, not so much a punitive thing. Those were considered to be generally a student court decision, and then usually go on to the institute board, because those would be the cases where students made a mistake but could learn by the mistake, but they need to be held responsible and needed to show that they were going to act responsibly by doing work hours. I mean, this is a very common, probationary. There was a very low level of probation that the student court pretty much had the ultimate responsibility for, that involved a corrective, a learning experience corrective objective rather than a punitive.
Who is in charge of enforcing the walk hours or fines or whatever was levied onto the students?
Well, the person or the department with whom they did the work hours was requested to report on whether the offended student actually did what they did. If they didn't do it, then that came back to the court, and then the student court would decide what more or what different should be done. So there was a follow-up. We didn't just say do the work orders and we don't want to see you again. There was accountability and follow-up on that.
Okay. So aside from singular student cases, did the student court also handle cases that involved several clubs disputing things, clubs or organizations?
I don't recall the student court getting involved in organization infractions like Greek organizations, for example. There were some problems with sports teams. There were some problems with fraternities, and I don't recall sororities, but there were occasions in which when I made the administrative decision to suspend a fraternity because of their infractions, I made sure that I had a strong case to do it, and they had the opportunity to appeal it. But when I suspended a fraternity, it didn't go to the Institute Hearing Board. It went directly to the president's office. One of the reasons for that is fraternities and sororities have faculty and staff advisors. They have alumni involved, alumni who are contributors to RIT. So and sometimes, in some occasions, there have been legal infractions. We had one instance in which we found out about a serious matter in one of the fraternities. We found out from the state police, who had been called in by one of the students who had been mistreated at a party and had gone straight to the police. So this had to be handled usually on a different level than the student system. So I think there was a student adjudication system, but then there also were matters mostly of organizational matters that had to be handled differently.
Do you remember which fraternity was suspended?
Pardon?
What fraternity did you suspend?
It was Theta Xi fraternity.
Okay. So any last thoughts about the student court, what lessons you learned from it, and whether potentially RIT should go back to having a dedicated student court as part of the student government body?
I'm really not in a position to speak, and I wouldn't even if I thought I was, critique what they do now, because I have confidence in the administration, I have confidence in the student leadership now. I think that we had a pretty good system then, but times change and students, I'm sure, I'm pretty confident that students recently, since I was involved, had a very good and strong voice and determined what they felt would work best for them. But that changes over time, and that's a good thing. I have complete confidence that what's done now is done very well.
All right. Well, that was the end of my questions. Thank you so much for coming to this interview.
Very good questions.
Thank you.
You have done your homework.
Yes, indeed.